It's the worst of the CBC for October 25th, 2019, the show where I watch the CBC so you don't have to. And there's two major things that I have learned, or not so much learned, but have been reaffirmed by watching today's CBC. One, when someone takes an ISIS flag and commits a terrorist attack, it's almost impossible to determine what the motive is if you work if you work in the media. I mean, what could the motive possibly be? And two, climate change, at least in part now, is some form of religion for some people. And you saw that in the CBC's coverage today. So the number one story that was covered today in the CBC was there was this rally for climate change in Vancouver where we have 5 children suing the federal government, and David Suzuki's there, and the Pope, Greta Thunberg is there. Maybe she's not the Pope of climate change, but she is some sort of saintly figure. And it really was interesting to watch in the coverage because you would saw Andrew Nichols say things. No, it was the reporter they had there. It's that people are jostling just to get a look at her. There's a real excitement when she comes to speak. Like, it was literally like, are we talking about a 16-year-old Swedish girl, or are we talking about the Pope? So there is in part this religious aspect now to climate change, in which we have believers and we have disbelievers, and the believers are good, the disbelievers are bad. I mean, my policy or my theory on this has always been, I've always thought that climate change rhetoric especially has been one of the most unhelpful and destructive things to, one, the social fabric, and two, the actual environment. Because you have priests of climate change, maybe she's more of a bishop, but Kathleen McKenna is anointed in the holy waters of climate change, is out there preaching, not so much doing anything. And she's preaching about carbon emissions. Oh, the great ye carbon emissions, right? These are sort of like Scientology has like theons. This is sort of the carbon emissions thing. And we're talking about these wide-scale carbon emissions on the whole planet on a global scale. But at the same time, while you're saying all that rhetoric, right, it's a feel-good stuff. So it makes you feel good. It makes you look good. It makes you sound like the good guy. And then while you're talking about the phadons, or the carbon emissions, you're dumping all the raw sewage into the St. Lawrence River and destroying those ecosystems. So I've always said that we have legitimate environmental concerns. Like, we can talk about ecosystem depletion. We can talk about eutrophication. We can talk about all these different issues and try and solve those issues. We can bioremediate this river. We can we can work to all these solutions, but what is never talked about in climate change rhetoric is real-world solutions to proximal issues. It's always what we need to do to save the world. Well, we need to destroy Western energy industries is always what it gets down to, or some sort of socialism. So again, we had people talking about intergenerational justice, climate justice, and as I say, when you hear someone talk about justice that has nothing to do with the legal system, what they mean is socialism all the time. So that was interesting. So that was they kept going back to that. Was like literally half the coverage today. There was a religious holiday for climate change. It's Climate Christmas or something, and they were covering that. And the Pope is coming. The Swedish Pope is here. The other story they covered. Now, I'm not sure if this is good or bad on CBC, but it was. They covered Abdul Sharif, the terrorist, or wait, we don't even know his motives, who, stabbed an Edmonton police officer, ran him down, came back in a U-Haul truck, tried to mow down people, was found with an ISIS flag in his car. And they were going on and on and on, and they were covering it, well, he was found guilty of this, and Abdul Sharif did this. I'm just sitting there for 5 minutes listening to it. It's like, are they going to say Islamic terrorism? Are they going to say ISIS? Are they going to mention any of this? And then they did mention ISIS, but they mentioned it in an interesting way, and they said, this is sort of a Canada-wide issue, that no terrorism charges were brought against him. I'm like, okay, so they're going to play the same, even though he had an ISIS flag in his car, and the jury didn't know that. So the jury wasn't even aware that he had an ISIS flag in his car. They didn't bring charges against him, so I think this is a system-wide problem. So this isn't so much on the media end, but the media will then use this later to prove its point. Whenever, if someone ever complains about Islamic extremism, they're going to say, well, if you look at the terrorist attacks in Canada, very few of them are committed by Islam, right? White supremacist terrorism is the number one. But here we have an instance where there's a man, Abdul Sharif, who attacked police officers, ran down 4 people in a car, did it because he said he had allegiances to ISIS, and had an ISIS flag in the car while he was doing it, and we didn't bring terrorism charges against him. Right? This is maddening. So I think this is sort of the prosecutors wanted to sort of be politically correct. They didn't want to have to deal with terrorism charges. And if someone in Canada was convicted, I think they kind of realized, oh, if I'm seen as the prosecutor that brings terrorism charges, I don't think the government's going to back me. So I think there's a lot of political correctness corrupting the system here. So, good on the CBC for eventually mentioning the ISIS thing, but we didn't talk, and then all the things we talked about is like, he didn't defend it. Like, we never talked about the real issue here, which is Islamic extremism. Did he have any connections? Was he radicalized anywhere? We didn't talk about any of the real issues. So not great job, or not even good job. Just they didn't get a 0 out of 100 on that, which is, I guess, a good job for the CBC. Now, what is the biggest omission of the day? The biggest omission of the day is the fact that we are no longer talking about Western alienation on the global news. I mean, I would say it's baffling if I was more naive, but it's really not surprising. I mean, the Wexit movement gained steam after the election, so they had to talk about it right after that. But I think the media, and I think this will be indicative of what Trudeau's government is going to do, is sort of pay lip service to it initially. But once they've seen that Jason Kenney is not going to actively push for separation, so separation threats aren't imminent, they don't have to cover it. That's kind of what I'm sensing here, is unless they're dealt with it. So I do think this will kind of backfire. I can see a Wexit party sort of being formed in Alberta. I do see that as a real possibility now, with the fact that we're just going to now ignore Alberta again. I think there's a real possibility that you will get a split of the right, which might lead to the NDP getting back in power. But I think the realistic way forward here now is you're going to see the media in the East sort of shut its eyes again and double down, and then you're going to see an actual separatist party form in Alberta and maybe in Saskatchewan, and then we'll have to cover it again, and we'll have to see how that goes. But I don't see this being good for the country. Anyway, so all in all, today's CBC gets, an extra Greta boost. We'll give it 4 Greta-themed Rosemary Barton faces out of 10. And again, defund the CBC, because it's only working. It's actively working to divide the country. So I will be back tomorrow. Actually, no episode tomorrow. We'll be back Sunday for Sunday's worst episode of the CBC.